How's it going, everybody? So many people ask me as a professional fighter about training. How many times do I train a week? How do you go about training? What kind of road work should I be doing? How hard should I be sparring? So many questions. What I'm going to do for you today is just give you a breakdown into the training camp that I took on when I boxed Lewis Isaacs. Now, this was a really hard fight, and this was the best shape I was ever in, and it was by far the toughest training camp I've ever endured. I trained for 8 weeks for this fight, and it ultimately served me well in winning a Fight of the Year contender. So this is the one where I pushed myself to the absolute max, and I just thought I'd share with you what I'd done over those 8 weeks of training. Now I'm going to break this down for you sort of piece by piece, sparring, road work, groundwork. I'm not necessarily going to give you what I did day by day because it varied, if I'm completely honest with you. No 2 Mondays were the same. I might spar on a Wednesday, but I can break it down for you in this. I trained for 8 weeks, and I would train 9 to 10 times a week. Ultimately, it consisted of a lot of sparring, a lot of road work, varying between hill runs, extremely steep hill runs or sprints on the treadmill. I do a lot of pad work and a lot of bag work too. We're talking 12 and 15 round sessions. I do a lot of groundwork and circuits as well, plus other stuff, a little bit of recovery, a little bit of stretching. But I'm going to break it down by you piece by piece and give you an overall of what my schedule looked like. My schedule revolved around 6 days on with 1 rest day, and on that rest day you completely relax. For the first couple of weeks of training, you're going around 60 to 70%. And that could be in the amount of rounds you're doing, the intensity you're going at, because you don't want to burn yourself out. So you got to make sure that you're not overtraining because you can burn yourself out. And you also don't want to prioritize the weight cutting too early because you don't want to make yourself feel too low. But as I was training for this Isaacs fight, I knew how tough this kid was. This kid was undefeated, touted to go on and do big things, had been a really good amateur, had about 4 times the amount of experience I'd had in the amateurs. I'd had just over 20 fights. Isaacs had 80 fights, and he was a bit of a knockout specialist in the amateurs. In the amateurs, not in the pros, because he was fighting a tough journeyman. So I knew I had to get myself in the best possible shape for this fight. Now, before I get into the routine, I need to give you a sort of outlook on training from my perspective. It is physical. It is 100% physical. You do need to get your body in fighting shape. You need to take body shots. You need to run the hills and strengthen your legs. But more so, in my opinion, especially if you lived a life as a boxer. Now, going into this fight, and just the way I was living my boxing life for years, is I was in the gym 5 days a week out of 7, 6 days a week out of 7. I was always training, so I was always fit anyway. This is just taking that physicality to the next level. But for me, training and training camps are more about the psychological benefits, pushing yourself to those dark places that inevitably you're going to experience in the ring in hard fights. You have to push yourself to those dark places, and hopefully you don't even have to get there in the fights, but you have to prepare for them. Now, I've had experiences in the ring where, I'll be the first round and I'll hit those dark places mentally, where my body just feels tired. The anticipation and the nerves, they get to you. So going through the training camp where there's no pressure on the line and it doesn't matter, and overcoming them there will ultimately give you the foundation and that mental strength to overcome it in the tough moments in a fight where it really matters. So starting off with sparring. Throughout this training camp and throughout most training camps, you don't typically, I had never typically sparred throughout the entire thing. The first 2 weeks I probably wouldn't spar. I would do around 6 weeks of sparring. Now, over 6 weeks of sparring for this fight, I did 103-minute rounds. Now, that would be broken down into different elements. So when I first started, I would spar 3 times weekly or twice weekly. 2 hard spars and a little sort of float around spar, which I wouldn't really count the rounds. But with this one, it would be hard sparring. So I started off. This fight was a scheduled 10-rounder. It got changed last minute out of my control in their hands to an 8-rounder. But I was preparing for 10 3-minute rounds. So I started off doing 6 rounds, 2 to 3 times a week. Now, that would be either getting a fresh opponent in, or a fresh sparring partner in, I should say, every 3 rounds, just to make sure that when you start getting tired, the guys coming in are fresh. Now, what you'll find is when you get really fit, that the more you get into the spar, actually the stronger you get, you end up developing a second wind. It's very strange. But as that went on, we would be sparring 6 rounds for 1 week, 6 rounds the next week. Ultimately, we probably did the 6-rounders 2 to 3 times a week for around 3 weeks. So probably from about 6 weeks out to 4, 3.5 weeks out. And then we took it to the next level. It ultimately was going to be a 10-round fight. So we started pushing the 8-rounders, where we would do 4 rounds in with 2 fresh opponents. So get a fresh opponent in after the 4th and push you hard. I did a lot of sparring with Ryan Martin, who's a very solid pro. I think he had about 18 or 16 pro fights. A couple of 6-rounders with Josh Kelly. I remember doing some really hard 8-rounders with Harlem Eubank. I've done quite a bit with Michael Conlon as well, who, although is a lot smaller than me, will give you that sharpness and keep you switched on because he's a sharp shooter and his bodywork is devastating. European champ Abbas Barral, I did quite a lot of rounds with, really good fighter. And Jermaine Brown, super middleweight English champion as well. So I was getting tons of rounds in. As I say, as it got closer to the fight, we would really push it. Probably around 2 weeks out, I started doing 12 rounds. So as I say, over 6 weeks, I did 100 rounds of sparring. Now that was a lot. I wouldn't want to be doing that much sparring all the time, but for that particular fight, which was a really hard fight, I actually felt the sparring was harder than the fight, so it was perfect preparation. There is a line where you can overdo the sparring and you can punch yourself out in the gyms. And then one of the things I introduced into this training camp was just varying up my running. I really intensified my running, and that made a massive difference for me. Now, I would always go on those long distance runs of 7Ks, occasionally push a 10K, get out a fast 5K, but for this one I ran 4 times a week. So that's 2 to 3 sparring a week and 4 runs a week. Now, one of my runs would just be a solid, steady 5 to 7 kilometer run. Don't push it too hard, just get the sweat flowing. And then I would also do a 10 to 12 kilometer run up the hills. Now, these are steep hills. Box Hill, it probably takes you about 3 minutes to get right to the top and all the way back down at 6 in the morning, 7 in the morning. It was grim. I hated every minute of it. We go up and down the hill, up and down. But for me, I never found anything that would emulate that fight exhaustion when the adrenaline and the nerves kick in, like Box Hill did. So we would sometimes do 3 of those hills, go up and down 3 times, and then do the zigzag road. And that's like a 2 kilometer hill road. And the other 2 runs were shorter sprints on a treadmill. There were the flat sprints where I would set the treadmill to 20 kilometers an hour to 23 kilometers an hour, which was the max, and I would keep it flat. I would jump on for 20 seconds and off for a 10 seconds rest and repeat that 20 times. Now what that was doing was getting me used to those explosive bursts I let go in the ring and quick recovery. So you can do a quick 4-punch combo and move and keep your lungs pumping. The other sprints I would do would be the hill sprints on the treadmill. So what we would do is we would do 10 rounds, 1 minute on and then a 1 minute recovery. Get the treadmill to around 8 to 10 to 12 kilometers an hour, but set it on a 12% incline and just hold on for a minute, 10 times over and over. Then that takes me on to the circuits, the abs and the conditioning too. What we would do is at times 300 reps, other times we'd get the kettlebell and do the kettlebell exercises. And we would just be at it for like an hour sometimes doing these ab exercises. And then in between, you get your legs off the floor and you get the belly punches. Yeah, ab exercises were grim, but a necessary evil because there's nothing worse than taking a body shot in the ring that you can't take. But we would do that sort of 3 times a week and just condition our bodies. Then you got the punching exercises, you know, the rounds on the bags, the rounds on the pads, just the repetition. This is probably the most important because this is where you're keeping your form. You're keeping your concentration when it's a little bit boring and you can easily switch off. Now, it was almost a foregone conclusion that at least 4 or 5 times a week, we would do 12 rounds of punching. Whether that's 12 3-minute rounds on a bag with a 30 seconds rest, or 8 rounds on a bag, 4 rounds on the pads. You know, we would sometimes do 15 rounds with circuits. Typically punching 5 times a week, we would do up to 12 rounds. That also includes shadow boxing where we do an additional 6 rounds. So sometimes that's 18 rounds of punching a day. Obviously you're working on stuff when you're punching, you know, you're setting your shots up, you're working on a game plan. For Isaacs, I knew I'd have to move. So I'm never just standing in one place on that bag. I knew I'd set him up to the body. So when I'm working the bag, bang, bang, just practice those body shots. And a big thing, one of the main things I noticed when I was in that gym with the top fighters is the bag is where they're the most switch on, the heavy bag. I watched Josh Kelly, who's an amazing mover, and he would throw a punch. Well, when you go into most gyms, they throw a punch, bang, I stand still. But those fighters put another step onto the rhythm, and it's their escape. It would be 1, 2, 3, and then they'd move. 4, move. So it was just making sure that you're doing everything necessary. You're moving after. And try doing that on a bag for 12 rounds. It's difficult to keep that level of focus. Moving after you punch. They're the things that make the fighters. The setups and the escapes are the things that separate those great fighters from the good fighters. I'd also do strength work just once a week. We would do circuits, like get the weights out, do the walking lunges, explosive stuff, kettlebell swings, barbell work. We would do that with Fozzy and just push that. And like I say, like 10 times a week, it's hard work. So it would be a case of recovery too. Massages whenever I could get them. Just breathing exercises just to slow the brain down. Lots of stretching and lots of rest. Honest to God, when I was doing this kind of training, it was completely miserable. You train in the morning and then I'd sleep, cook, train in the evening, cook and sleep, and just repeat for 8 weeks. It was grim. To be honest with you, I hated every second of it. But like I say, a necessary evil. One of the hardest and darkest places I took myself was during those 8 weeks when I was training for that fight. But anyway, that was my routine. Hopefully it helped you. As I say, that wasn't my yearly routine. Please don't take that as what I was training every week. I wasn't doing that every week, especially after I went through that. I tapered it down a lot when I wasn't preparing for fights. But sometimes you got to get in there and you got to get tough, especially when you have a really hard fight coming for a small period of time. But yeah, hopefully that's informative. As honest as I can be, to be honest with you. Like I say, with the sparring, that was very hard. Don't always spar too hard. You got to look after your head, and a lot of fighters get punchy in sparring. So at times you got to push yourself to the max. Other times you got to look after yourself. But that is how I trained for my professional fights.